Hello, hello. Y'all, give up a round of applause for Stephen and the band. They did a wonderful job tonight leading us in worship. But yeah, as Emma said, if you recognize my face, I'm usually up here, but it was really cool tonight to get to be here and be on this side of the stage and get to worship with y'all down here instead of up here. It's cool to see both sides of it. Before we get rolling with the message tonight, I have a hypothetical situation to work through with you. So we're going to do some interaction. Here's a question. Raise your hand if you have a favorite musician. Don't share it, but just put a hand up. Do you have a favorite musician? Okay. Most of you probably do. Now, keep your hand up if that favorite musician is Taylor Swift. Wow. Like none of you. Okay. I really thought there was going to be a more positive response to that example. But so let's run through this hypothetical situation. So let's say your favorite band, your favorite musician, it's not Taylor Swift. It's insert whoever you want it to be. And so imagine with me, you're sitting in this restaurant, you're with your friends, you're having a great time, you're talking, life is good, life is normal, and then, for the sake of the example, in walks Taylor Swift. What happens? What do? What comes next when Taylor Swift or insert musician walks into the room? Now, imagine further, what if Taylor Swift or whoever else comes up to you and they speak to you by name? You've never met them. They should have no idea who you are. And not only do they know your name, but they start talking to you and asking you how your class is going. How's this teacher that you can't stand? How's this friendship going? Like, how was last weekend when you went such and such place? Some of you guys might be like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Others of you, the camp that I would find myself in is, who are you? Why do you know this? I did not give you this information. Run, exactly. That's the response all of you should give if somebody you don't know comes up to you and starts telling you things about your life. Run. That's good. Take that home. That's a good takeaway point. So the reason that I bring up this situation talking about, so let's say this grand figure like Taylor Swift or whoever knows you and knows you personally, is we're going to be looking at a passage in Psalms that's talking about how God knows us and knows us personally. So if y'all would, go ahead and turn, if you have your Bibles, to Psalm 139. That's the text that we're going to be in tonight. We love the Bible. The Bible's great. So while you guys are turning there, just some quick kind of context on what we're going to look at. We know this psalm was written by David. We don't know when he wrote it, but we know it's likely in a time where he's got enemies around him. So Israel is not at peace. David's in a time where war is on the horizon. But mostly what he does in this psalm is it's a prayer. He's speaking to God, and he's praising him for his nature. And as we read through it, we're going to learn some pretty major foundational truths about who God is that are really key to our understanding of not only who God is, but who we are to God. That's kind of the main focus, is who am I to God? And so what we're going to do, it's a lot of verses. We're going to break it up into smaller sections. I have a lot of points on the screen, so if you take notes, this is for you. I wrote them out for you. So we will start. I'm going to go ahead and read the first 6 verses of Psalm 139. I'm reading from the ESV. It's right here. Read along with me. It says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it." So another illustration for you. Have you guys ever been in a situation where you feel like your parents just know everything that you do, even if you maybe don't want your parents to know some things that you did? Like, I don't know. I know my brother and I growing up, we would always get a little rough sometimes, do some wrestling. And sometimes, I'm not going to say how often, that would happen when no parents were home. And because no parents are home, you can go crazy. You can wrestle as rough as you want to. And sometimes that led to one of us hitting a wall in the hallway, which were covered in picture frames always, not convenient at all for wrestling. And said picture frame may or may not have come off the wall. But then it's fine. Just clean it up, put it back on the wall. Life goes on. Mom's not going to find out. Mom always finds out. That's how it works. That's another thing to take home. Mom always finds out, and if a stranger knows who you are, run away. First 2 points of the evening. But that's kind of the gist that we're getting from this passage, right? God is a God who knows everything. He's not surprised by anything. There's nothing that happens that catches him off guard. He's aware, and not only does he know, but he understands everything. And that's not just like small things. Like, he understands how the universe works. He created it. He understands how we work, how nature works, how science, like, you name it. God understands it. God knows it. But what David's saying here is that not only does God know everything, but God knows you. And that's the first point of this evening, is the God who knows all knows you. David starts in verse 1. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." So God's knowledge, it's not just God happens to be aware of who David is. God is searching David. God's knowledge of us is not accidental or impersonal. It is intentional and intimate. And David continues to kind of flesh out this idea. We see three specific things that he says about God's knowledge in these first 6 verses. The first is this: God knows our insignificant actions. So jumping back to the passage, in verse 2 it says, "You know when I sit down and when I rise up." And then verse 3, "You search out my path and my lying down." This is literally, God, you know when I sit down. You know when I stand up. You know when I go to sleep at night. The things that we honestly don't even care about on any given day, God knows, God understands, and God thinks of. The second thing that David points out is that God knows our thoughts and our words. Jumping back to the text again, in verse 2, in the second part, it says, "You discern my thoughts from afar." Verse 4, "Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." So what David's saying is, before words leave our mouth, God knows that they're on our tongue. Before the words go to our tongue, God knows that these words have been in our head. And before these words ever even come into our head, God knows that they're going to be thoughts. So not even our mind, which is honestly probably one of the most personal and intimate things that we have, not even that's hidden from God. God knows it, he sees it, he understands it. And then the last thing that we see from this set of verses about what God knows is that God knows and directs our steps. Jumping back again to the text, it says in verse 3, "You search out my path and my lying down." And then in verse 5, "You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me." So God knows where we're going. He knows the plan for our life. He knows what we're going to be doing tomorrow and the day after that and 5 years from now. And he's got his hand on us. He's not just aware of it, but he's also leading and he's guiding and he's directing and calling us to live in a way that he wants us to live. And then David closes and says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it." He's not talking here about God's knowledge of everything. He's saying, "God, your knowledge of me is too wonderful for me to understand. I can't even attain the knowledge that you have of just me, much less all of the other knowledge that God has." And David continues, continuing to move through the passage, picking back up in verse 7, he jumps. So we've established God knows everything, and yet he knows you specifically. And then David's going to talk about a new concept about who God is and God's connection to us. So if you would read along with me, starting in verse 7, it says, "Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol," which, pause, if you're not familiar, that's just a Hebrew word for like death or the grave. So he said, if I go to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in the grave, you are there. Verse 9, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for the darkness is as light with you." So David, he starts off and he asks this kind of rhetorical question of, where can I go to escape from you, God? The answer is nowhere, which he then walks through and explains. He's kind of laying this foundation in verses 7 through 12. We've established, okay, God knows everything and yet knows us. And here in these verses, we see, second point of the evening, the God who is everywhere is with you specifically. The God who is everywhere is with you. So David, he starts here and he says, if I go to heaven, you're already there. If I go to the grave, you're already there. Verse 9 is really cool. I get nerdy about like literature and stuff. So he's saying this really poetic thing of like, if I take the wings of the morning to the edges of the sea. Basically what he's saying is, if I rise with the dawn, with the sun, and go where the light goes to the uttermost parts of the earth. You're already there. It makes me think of the scene from Lion King with Mufasa and Simba. He's like, everything the light touches. That's what David's saying, is there is nowhere that he can go, whether known by man or beyond our understanding, that God is not already. And then he says something really interesting in verse 10. So we've established, you're everywhere, I can't escape you, there's nowhere I can go that you're not there. And then in verse 10, he says, and even there, your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. So God's presence is not passive. The fact that God is everywhere doesn't mean that he just happens to be there. It means that he's everywhere, and everywhere he is able to act as God. And so David continues, he's fleshed out, like, okay, God, you're everywhere. Not only are you everywhere, but you're able to act in my life everywhere. And then he says something interesting again. Looking back at the text in verse 11, he says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. So David's kind of setting up this scenario where there's just darkness all around him. And he says, not only is there darkness all around me, but the light might as well be dark too. He's kind of painting this picture of just complete hopelessness, complete feeling of being lost and abandoned and not knowing what to do. But he says, God, you're there. And not only are you there, but you're making the darkness light. For your glory and for my good, you are there and you are working in this darkness when I can't see the light. Which is true of us as well. As we read through this passage, all these things that David is saying about his relationship with God and who God is to him is true of who God is to us. We're gonna keep rolling. Is everybody still tracking? We're doing good? Okay, we're going to keep rolling through this passage. David just keeps on trucking. He keeps bringing up these new points. So we'll jump back into verse 13, and we'll engage with this new idea that David is putting forward. So if you read along with me, verse 13, it says, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So we know, if we've read Genesis before, if you guys have somewhat of a church background, we all know the creation story, right? God creates everything. He speaks and there's light, and then there's earth and water and sky, and everything is filled with creatures and life and everything. That same God created us. And that's the third point of this evening, is the God of creation created you specifically. Look at how David starts in verse 13. He says, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. That language isn't, oh, God happened to create me, just like it wasn't, God happens to know me or happens to be with me. Knitting, like, the knitting with the needles and thread and stuff, like that's detailed, that's focused, that's intricate. David's saying, God, my substance while I was being formed in the womb, you were over all of that. Every fiber of my being that was placed to make me who I am, that was by your doing. That was by your work and your focus in that. And he goes on, he says, okay, God, you've created me. You created me specifically from my internal workings to my external appearance. And then he starts in verse 15. He says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. So now David's putting forth this idea that before we were ever created, before God started creating us, he saw us and knew us. So before the work of creation of you and of me and of David ever began, God knew who we were going to be. Again, not only that, David's just really building off of all of these foundational truths and adding depth to it. He says, not only did God create us personally, not only did God know that he was going to create us before he did create us, also God knew our days before we had any days. So God's plan for your life existed before you did. Just think about that for a second. That's crazy. Like, God's plan for your life existed before you did. Before you had the questions, God already had the answers. And that's something that's so easy to forget, I think, as we go through life. But David's reminding us, he's calling us to remember God saw you, he knew you, and he had a plan and a call for your life before you ever had the questions of what that was. And David closes. We're going to see his response. The rest of the chapter, verses 17 through 24, he's reflecting on everything that he said, everything that you and I have just read through, and then he's going to share his thoughts and how we respond to that. So if you would, read along with me in verse 17. It says, "How precious to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I wake, and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." That fits, right? That doesn't seem out of place at all, the whole complete hatred of other people. Like, yeah, easy. We can go home now. This sticks out. This is weird, right? We've been talking this whole time about, God, you're so wonderful, you're so great. We're reflecting on the vastness of who God is, and yet his personal pursuit of us and his personal understanding of us. And then David comes in with this, and it's like, slay the wicked, God, I hate them. And it doesn't seem to fit with the theme of what we've been talking through. But we're going to see, hopefully, that it actually does. And we'll talk through that in just a second. But first, let's start where David started. He started in verse 17. He says, "How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you." So God's thoughts should be precious to us. When we understand who God is, we understand the greatness of his knowledge, we understand the greatness of his presence, we understand the greatness of him as creator and as Lord of all of what we see and what we don't see. And in all of that, when we understand the greatness of his desire to know us and the fact that he already does, his thoughts should be precious to us. I think the Pride of a Father song was a really cool pick for tonight, to know, like, God looks at us, he thinks of us. Who are we that he's mindful of us? That's so undeserved. And David acknowledges that and responds and just says, God, your thoughts are precious. And we should respond the same way. And then, now let's talk about the slay the wicked people bit. So how does this fit? How does this work? I've already said this, but to restate it, so what we've been talking about, right, is just the glory, the goodness, the wonder, the beauty of who God is. This is God's nature, this is his character, this is who he is to us, this is how we should view ourselves in light of who he is. So how could we want anything that is not of God? When we understand just the weight of the beauty of God in his, just himself, just who he is, how could we be fine with anything that is contradictory to God? And that's kind of where David is pulling this from here. He's been reflecting and just magnifying God for his goodness, because what is wickedness? What is evil? What is sin? It's anything that's contradictory to who God is, to what God says is good. And so when we have a true understanding of what goodness is according to who God is, how else should we respond besides hating wickedness? We should despise sin when we see sin. We should despise evil and wickedness, because that's not of the Creator that we understand, who knows all and knows us, who is with all and is with us, and who is creator of all and yet created us. But I do want to speak to that a little bit more, because I don't think the application of this passage is to go and be like, we hate lost people because they don't know God. False. Bad. That's not what David's saying. That's not what we're going to walk away with. I wrote down a quote that I think is helpful to kind of work through this. I think it's on the screen. Yeah, there it is. It says, "We are neither to hate others for the sins they practice, nor to love the sins for the sake of those who practice them. So it's kind of along the lines of like, love the sin or hate the sin, but I think this kind of captures it a little bit better. I'll read it one more time. It says, "We are neither to hate others for the sins they practice, nor to love the sins for the sake of those who practice them." So we don't read this passage and we don't go back to school or back to home or wherever we find ourselves and be hateful towards people who don't understand the goodness of God. But we also don't choose to love sin for the sake of sparing the feelings of people who don't know God. What they need is they need to understand the God who knows all and knows them, and who is with all and is with them, and who created all and created them. And they need to surrender their life to him because that's what he's calling them to. And that's this one isn't written down, but something that helped me kind of understand it as well. It's another quote. I don't remember who it was from, so apologies for plagiarism. But he's basically saying the gist of it is like, we don't hate what God created people to be, because people were created in the image of God, everybody, even the wicked people that David is talking about. But we do hate what people turn themselves into. When we see just the complete brokenness of sin, when we look at our own life, let's stop pointing the finger at other people for a second. Just look at ourselves. Like, we should hate the sin in our life if we know who God is, because how could we not? Because it's so contradictory to God's goodness and his glory. So hopefully that kind of cleared up where David's coming from and how we kind of understand and navigate this passage. And David has one final closing thought to this whole prayer. He's praised God. He's regarded God's thoughts as precious. He's talked about his hatred of wickedness and his hatred of evil because of who God is. And then in verse 23, he closes and he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." So David's prayer here at the end is a prayer for God to continue searching him, to continue to know him more. But we should pay attention to this, because David's already established. Is there anything more about David left for God to find out that he doesn't already know? No. There's nothing about David. Nothing surprises God. Remember, nothing is new to God. So what is he saying here? What's his request of God? And I think verse 24 gives us insight into that. It says, "See if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." So what David is doing here is he's praying to God, and he's saying, "God, please search me, search my heart, search my thoughts, search my actions, so that you can lead me to love you more, and to live a life that honors you more, and to love others well more." David is praying, "God, in light of who you are, please search me and reveal to me the things that I need to let go of so that I can be a better servant of you." And that's kind of the heart of this whole psalm, even with all of the wickedness and everything, going back to that. David's prayer, his desire, is that God would reveal to himself being David, his wickedness and his brokenness, so that he can be changed by God. And it is only by God that we can become more like him. And David understands that, and we need to understand that. We need to come before God, and we need to ask him, "God, change my heart, change my mind, change my speech." And so what do we do with this psalm? We've established a bunch of things about God. We've established a bunch of things about ourselves. So how do we respond? Where do we go from here? The first thing is respond like David did. We just talked about David gets to the conclusion of all of this, and he asks God, "God, change me." If you are a believer in this room, this matters for you. If you're not a believer in this room, if you don't know the Lord as your Savior, this matters for you. When we consider just the beauty of who God is and his glory and his greatness, we should desire to be more like him. And it's only by his hand that we can do that. And that goes into things like, okay, you guys are going back to school. How do I share the gospel more? Pray that God would lead you in the way everlasting and remove the grievous ways from your life. How do I love my brothers and sisters better at home instead of fight with them all the time? Pray this prayer. How do I navigate this broken situation that I'm walking through that seems so overwhelming and so hopeless? Pray this prayer. God will search your heart. God will reveal to you what needs to be changed, and he will call you into further relationship with him because, calling back to before, he knows you deeper than you can ever know yourself, and he already knows what he's calling you to. He already knows where he's leading you, and that's true whether you've been a Christian for a long time or you just got saved or you're not even a believer yet. This prayer is a call for you. And the second and last application point is this. Know that God thinks of you. And this is, we said, like the main point is, okay, who am I to God? Know that God thinks of you. And again, this is for everybody in this room, no matter what part in your walk with the Lord you're in. Consider the God who knows all, who understands the tides and the oceans and the winds and understands all of the grand things that we study in school that we probably are just ready to get over with. Like, God understands that so deeply and is master of all of that and has all of these thoughts in his head and still thinks of you personally. He thought of David personally. He thinks of me personally. And there's hope to be found in that. What kind of God, referencing the song again, who am I that you're mindful of me? Who are we that God would consider us significant to him? That's so undeserved. Not only that, not only does God know all, but know us. God is everywhere. He's in your classrooms. He's in this room. He's in your home. He's in the places that you haven't been yet and the places that you haven't been to in a long time. He's in the universe. He's in the earth. Like what David did. Let's write a long list, and the answer is going to be the same for every single one. And this same God whose presence is so great and so abounding and so wonderful is still with you. He's with you as you go. And not only is he with you, but he's actively got his hand on your life. He's actively working in your life to call you to himself, to call you to know him more, to call you to pursue his will. And again, that's who are we to have a God who considers us in the way that our God considers us? And then the last point that David talked about is that God is the God of creation. This one is probably one of the craziest ones to me, because when we talk about the story of Adam and Eve, what was Adam made out of? Do y'all remember? Dirt. We're made of dirt. God created us from dust. And right, like we're not all picked up out of the ground. Like that was special for Adam and Eve. But in concept, like where did we come from? We came from the dust. What value does dust have? Only the value that God gave it. Only the value that God gave to us. This same God who spoke and there was light, and who spoke and there was earth and there was sea, and who spoke and then this expanse of new creation was filled with creatures. And then now there's all of these laws of physics and chemistry and all of these things that are holding it together. The same God who's actively sustaining his creation and keeping this world moving forward, keeping this universe moving forward, knit you together in your mother's womb, piece by piece, intricately, personally, with a plan and with a purpose and with a desire for how you should live. I know some of you guys, I think this is true of all of us, referencing back to what David was talking about in verses 11 and 12, where he's talking about just this darkness that covers us and this darkness that overwhelms us. We can resonate with that. We all walk through that. Some of us are in it right now. But this God that David's speaking of, this God that we get to come and we worship together, and this God who speaks to us through his word, he goes with us in our darkness, and he acts in our darkness. So if there are those of you who are here, if you're a believer or if you're not, there's feelings of, I'm alone. Nobody knows me. I'm by myself. Nobody understands me. Or maybe there's feelings of, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's around me. I feel like I'm just going through this all on my own, and I don't know how to navigate it, and it's overwhelming. Or maybe I have no value. I have no purpose. I have no direction in my life. Know that God thinks of you. this wonderful and beautiful, glorious God thinks of you. And so if you are a believer in this room, my challenge to you would be to consider that. Don't forget that. Even if you're not in a season of feeling particularly confused, just take some time. Just think about creation. Just think about the vastness of what we can see, and just ponder on the fact that God is Lord of all of that and still chooses to be Lord of your life in such a way that he knows you more than you know yourself. If you don't know the Lord in this room, I would challenge you, don't neglect the God who knows you more than you know yourself. He understands you. He is with you. He is leading you. He's calling you. And he wants you to know him so that you can continue to know him more and so that he can lead you in the way everlasting, like David talks about. So I'm going to pray, and Stephen, if you want to go ahead and come up here. If I would challenge you guys, if you want to stand, go ahead and stand and sing. But if there's things on your mind, I would encourage you to just take some time to sit and spend time with the Lord in prayer, and pray this prayer that David prayed of, search me, know my heart, try me, know my ways, and lead me in the way everlasting.